program update from Danielle Piernanzi, our program lead. And then we'll hear directly from project teams of 2 recent projects and make time for Q&A after each presenter. So there should be plenty of time for you to ask your questions. We'd like to make you aware of one adjustment to the agenda today. One of our planned presenters who was going to speak to the Gulf State Park project is not able to join. She's, I think, somewhat occupied with cleanup efforts from Hurricane Sally last week. Thankfully, Rebecca are no injuries, and she will be joining our sites community call in November. So hold the date for November 18th. I think this will be an interesting story to learn more about. Rebecca may even be on the call today, so I think Danielle will be able to touch base on this later in the presentation. Danielle, if you could advance to the CEU slide, thank you. We want to just make sure that everybody is aware we are recording this session. We will send out all the slides and the recording to attendees and registrants afterwards. And we encourage you throughout the presentation to send your questions and comments in the chat box or in the Q&A section below it. Feel free to send these again as we go through the presentation. As with previous community calls, the presentation is approved for one site CEU specific credit, the live presentation. So there's no need to note the course details. They'll be included in the follow-up materials. So thank you again for joining us, and I'd like to turn it right to Danielle now to dive right in. Thanks, Danielle.
Thanks, Anna Grace. Hello, welcome everyone. Again, my name is Danielle Piernanzi, Sites Program Manager at GBCI. As mentioned, I'll try to provide a very brief sites overview and share any updates to date before passing it on to our main presenters of the day. Just for those of you that are new to sites, I do want to give a little background. Since its inception, sites was developed with rigor and flexibility in mind, applying to a wide variety of project types, sizes, and locations, as you can see from these images, but also as you will hear from today with the projects that you'll hear about. Sites fills an important gap in properly addressing the space outside of and between buildings, yet also for projects with no buildings at all, because while every building has a site, not every site has a building. With that said, sites and LEED can be used in tandem like the 2 projects you will hear about today. The Sites V2 rating system and accompanying reference guide outline the criteria for guiding and measuring sustainable land design and development. It consists of 18 prerequisites, 48 optional credits, totaling 200 potential points. Basic certification requires to get 70 of those, and as you can see, the highest level at Platinum challenges projects to go above and beyond to demonstrate leadership. In addition to certification, we introduced this year a pre-certification pathway for projects in their planning phase, so they don't have to be built. Today, we have pre-certified projects in the US, China, Japan, and Brazil. And more details can be found on the certification page of our website about that. Beyond points and credits, Sites was developed to ensure we create places that are designed to last and meant to give back. In other words, appreciate and value. These landscapes and outdoor spaces fit within their context in terms of climate, ecology, culture, and community. They conserve resources, clean our air and water, enhance our well-being, foster resilience, and provide essential ecosystem services. I really like this quote from Mark Berman at the University of Chicago, really emphasizing the connection between public health and green space in our cities and communities, that it's a necessity and not an amenity or only an amenity. And this really goes toward not just public health, but resilience and habitat and so on. So the Sites rating system is intended to be a living product that will evolve over time as research and experience generate more knowledge. And so with that said, pilot credits are a means to introduce and test new ideas that are not in the current version of the rating system. This Safety First pilot credit, introduced this past summer, was created in response to the ongoing global pandemic and is in line with USGBC's Global Economic Recovery Strategy as a way to ensure health and safety indoors and outdoors. The intent of this credit is to promote best practices in operations and management of landscapes, parks, and other outdoor spaces to take precautions against the spread of COVID-19. The requirements refer to the National Recreation Park Association risk assessment tool for creating an assessment and a set of requirements for a site-specific management and operations plan that addresses various practices from physical distancing and cleaning practices to addressing the impact on equity and inclusion in modified operations. This credit also requires the necessary communication and training to implement this assessment and plan for all the site facility managers, maintenance personnel, contractors, and other relevant parties. In another new pilot credit, we are rewarding sites education and training done by project team members of a site's project. So those who have obtained their site's AP credential. So each of these pilot credits are worth 3 points under the innovation section of the rating system, and they can be found on the resources page of our website. As you can see on the bottom left, the URL there. So overall, sites projects run the gamut. To date, here's a quick snapshot of the 194 registered and certified projects. In total, projects are represented in 13 countries, including the US, Canada, China, Japan, Thailand, Malaysia, Argentina, Brazil, Peru, Mexico, Italy, Spain, and Greece. In the US, projects are located in 38 US states and Washington, DC. So to wrap up, I want to emphasize that sites is more than a rating system, more than certification. It's really trying to implement these global goals at the project level and facilitating the development of regional and local action, as we have seen with the Atlanta Beltline and City of Chicago, for example. It's also building a global community of committed organizations and professionals like yourself. And with this in mind, we recently launched the Sites Community Partner Program. So we invite your organization, if you haven't yet, to join Sites as it lays the foundation for an active community of users, practitioners, and visionaries. It is through our combined efforts that positive change is made. So by becoming a Sites community partner, you'll gain an opportunity to share relevant research, feedback, and input with GBCI to evolve the Sites rating system and inform the future direction of the Sites program, receive early access to latest news, updates, and opportunities, and more. Specifically, if it's an academic institution, we're offering complimentary Sites reference guide for their library systems. So please visit our website for more details and registration. And now I'm very pleased to introduce our next speakers who will share their experience with one of those projects, the recently certified Columbus Land Port of Entry, a stunning project in the desert of New Mexico. Aaron Zam is the principal landscape architect at MRWM Landscape Architects in Albuquerque and has over 15 years of experience, primarily in the design of high-performance public landscapes throughout the Southwest. He has extensive knowledge of native plants and water conservation principles in landscape architecture, and he manages some of the firm's most complex projects. Howe was the landscape designer at MRWM also in Albuquerque, and she completed her Master's of Landscape Architecture degree at UNM, including a thesis project on green stormwater infrastructure. She is a certified water harvesting practitioner through the Watershed Management Group. So with that, I'll pass that to Aaron and Tess.
Thanks, Danielle. I appreciate it. We're very excited to tell you about our project in Columbus, and we're thrilled that we received our silver site certification just a couple months ago in July. So this project's fresh in our minds, and the documentation and certification are fresh in our minds, and so we're excited to review it all with you today. So thanks for inviting us. And my colleague Tess is going to sort of share the stage with me today, and we're going to tag team this presentation, so she'll jump in just a minute. So as Danielle said, we're with MRWM Landscape Architects. We're in Albuquerque. Our firm's focus is primarily on government and institutional projects and clients, and we have a real emphasis on work in arid landscapes and in green stormwater infrastructure. Can go to the next slide. So the project team is here. So the architect and the prime consultant for the overall project was Richter Architects out of Corpus Christi. So we worked alongside them and did all the landscape architecture, irrigation design, construction administration. We were also the lead for the site's documentation for the project. Hensel Phelps was the general contractor, and then our client was the U.S. General Services Administration, the GSA. So they managed this project for the owner and user, which is the U.S. Customs and Border Protection. So the project is a border crossing facility in southern New Mexico, and I'll pass it to the next slide and let Tess give you a little bit about the context.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. So as you can see from the map, this site is located in the Chihuahuan Desert. The photos along the bottom show the landscape adjacent to the site. So it's Chihuahuan Desert landscape or grasslands with mountains in the distance. It is at 4,000 feet above sea level, and as you can see, the annual precipitation is right about 9.4 inches, with most of that coming during a late summer monsoon season in a typical year. Next slide, please. So this slide shows the old port. So the project that we worked on replaced this old port to expand the capabilities for travelers coming through. So along the bottom of the photo is Mexico, and then above that yellow line is the United States. And that red outline shows the rough border of the new site. So this renovation increased the port area to about 29 acres. Next slide, please. Here are a few photos of the old port. So on the bottom, you can see looking from the port south into Mexico. And as you can see, there's a lot of concrete, a few shade trees, but not a lot of landscaping. Next slide, please. So that's a little bit of the site background and site context. So now I'll give some information on the project overview. As you can see in the circulation diagram on the right, which was provided as part of site's documentation, this facility accommodates many user groups. In the red, you see the pedestrian circulation, which includes students who cross the border daily to attend school in Columbus and Deming, New Mexico. In purple, you see school bus drop-off and public transit. In blue, you see private commercial vehicles. In green, you see, in blue, you see the private vehicles, and in green, you see commercial vehicles. And then in yellow, you see the primary circulation routes for port employees. Safely accommodating and separating these user groups was a primary driver in the site design, and of course, maintaining the port security requirements, which are very stringent. And as Aaron said, the client was the General Services Administration, but there are many federal agencies that use this port and have employees in the port. Next slide, please. So these are going to be a few photos just to give you a sense of the completed project. So here you can see on the right a pedestrian path separated from the private vehicle lanes, and then on the right some of the landscape that we'll get into a little bit later. So this is looking north from Mexico toward the United States. Next slide, please. So here's a close-up of that pedestrian walkway. It is shaded and features high SRI paving materials. And here you can see some of the students, some of the hundreds of thousands of student crossings to attend school in the United States. Next slide, please. And here you can see one of the commercial vehicles going through inspection for the port. And in the foreground, the gabion walls that were used throughout the site feature concrete that was salvaged from the old port and reused in gabion walls and mattresses throughout the site. Next slide, please. And I'm going to turn it over to Aaron to go over user feedback and sustainability goals.
So thanks, Tess. I won't read this quote, but what's exciting about it is this got posted to us in response to some social media posts that went out, and we haven't, the project's very new and haven't had a lot of opportunities to collect user feedback, but this one's particularly exciting to us because this is from someone who has passed through this port as a pedestrian to school in the United States her entire life, and as a young adult is sort of acknowledging and recognizing what a difference this landscape and the design and the landscape architecture in particular has made on her experience coming to the United States. Next slide. So we've been asked to talk about some of the project's sustainability goals. So from the client, specifically from GSA, we had a couple of mandates going into this. The first one is that we achieve CITES Gold certification, and this is per updated set of GSA facility standards that came out and was finally published in 2014. Well, at that point, our project was already well into design. We were at about the 30% design stage. And by the time this updated mandate to follow sites was given to us and went through the procurement process with the government to get that added scope into our work, we were nearing 60% design. So that's one challenge that I hope many of you don't have to encounter on your projects, and that is to sort of have to retroactively come back and figure out how sites can fit into your project. That's sort of a lessons learned that, you know, had we had the opportunity to start from the beginning, it would have certainly helped us and possibly influenced some of the things we did. But by the time we were working towards site certification, we had passed many milestones. Another goal that came from the GSA was to follow a recent White House Pollinator Health Task Force set of guidelines, which is their strengthened federal guideline documents that increase pollinator habitat, and specifically they're increasing pollinator habitat quantity and quality on federally managed facilities. So that was something new that came out when we were in the midst of design that we were mandated to follow. And then the project itself sort of internally had some sustainability goals that we'll elaborate on. So on-site stormwater management was one of them, native plant revegetation to the site, and water and energy conservation. Next slide. Also want to highlight some design strategies that we use to help meet sites credits. So we're going to go through 3 of them today. These are sort of broad categories. So interdisciplinary site design to manage the stormwater and support vegetation, really looking specifically at the site soils and when thinking about the vegetation restoration, and then creating a sense of place, a design that's true to its context and it's sensitive to its ecosystem, while also thinking about the human comfort. So these are not only pedestrians, but also port employees that are spending a lot of time at this site and outdoors at this site. Next slide. So that first strategy, we determined early on that we wanted to have a goal of managing the 100 percentile storm event on site. So we really, our site was somewhat restricted. The previous port experienced flooding. They have real problems sending stormwater to adjacent private landowners and flooding their sites. We were sending water across the international border. So stormwater is a real problem. The site's very flat. It has no storm drain system to speak of. So it was a goal early on to try to manage all of our stormwater on site. So we were sort of forced to do that because of the flooding issues, but it resulted in a lot of credits through the sites program, which is great. I won't list all of those, but for those of you that are deep into the documentation process or incorporating sites into a project, that's the list of credits that this particular strategy had an impact on. Next slide. This is a graphic that we put together as part of the documentation to show the proximity of all of the various stormwater features on site to the high traffic areas. So where pedestrians and private vehicles are traveling, and also where all the commercial traffic moves through the site. So the point here is that not only are we dealing with stormwater on site, but we're not hiding it or sending it to a low point and making it disappear. We're spreading that out across a very flat site, and we're making it, we're treating it, we're putting it to beneficial use to the landscape, but we're also making it a very visible feature to the people that move through the site. Another point here is that we had very poor soil infiltration. So, you know, sending the water to, well, it's very flat, so it'd be difficult to make it all go to one low point, but to do that, and with the very poor infiltration we had, would meant that they would have standing water for long periods of time. So the strategy was also to distribute that water across the entire site to give it a better chance to infiltrate more quickly, and again, not making it disappear and act like it's not there and it's sort of a forgotten issue, but instead really highlighting that water in the landscape. Next slide. So along with that was educating visitors to the port. So this is interpretive signage that pedestrians can see as they're walking through, that's explaining what's going on. It's talking about very limited rainfall and the tendency of that rainfall to come in large storm events, and how is the design and the landscape that you're seeing in front of you function, and how are we putting that stormwater to beneficial use in very harsh environment. Next slide. So some photos here that show that distribution of water across the site. Now, we're showing you a lot of images that are right after recent storm events, so that you can kind of see how that water is very visible. It's distributed in these shallow basins throughout the site, and these are all landscape areas that you know, can benefit from that storm water. There's no curbs and gutters anywhere on the site. All of the pavement can sheet flow immediately adjacent to landscape areas. So that really comes back to that interdisciplinary design strategy as a team working together to work towards that goal. And next slide. Another image of the shallow basin. This is on the commercial side. This is when construction is still going on, so the landscape sort of got phased in over time, and you can see the growth from the revegetation. This entire site was disturbed, and in fact, most of the soil was imported from nearby. So you can see the growth in native grasses and vegetation that's happening very quickly during the initial phases of construction. And one of the issues that we'll talk a little bit more about is the soil and salinity in particular. So salt, there's very high salts in the soil, and also this inundation of water for periods of time after storm events. So being very careful about plant selection that can handle both the salts, the drought, and also inundation at the same time. So it's a real challenging combination. Next slide. So our second strategy was related to the soil. So the idea is that we wanted to be very specific to the site and the site constraints when it came to selecting plant material. There's a tendency to, in landscape design, landscape architecture, to overly amend or to assume that you need to overly amend the soils, or you end up applying lots of materials or chemicals to change the pH or to reduce the salinity. You'll get a soils test and a soils lab recommendation to leach salts from the soil and put lots of water on it to get the salts out of there. But in reality, what we found was that the pH and the salt we were dealing with was not uncommon to native Chihuahuan desert grasslands. So we knew that if we could be very careful about our plant selections, that we could actually work with the soils on site. Again, a list of credits that this particular strategy had an impact on. Next slide. And this image, again, is pretty early in the project, and when construction, I think, is just wrapping up, but it's kind of nice to show the juxtaposition of this highly industrial port facility and equipment and inspection equipment adjacent to what is you know, our goal of creating a restoration of a desert landscape. And I'll pass it to Tess for the next design strategy.
So the last strategy we want to emphasize is that this design really tried to, as Aaron said, capture the sense of place and embrace the local ecology. And in the Chihuahuan Desert, the spring and fall seasons can be very comfortable for people, but to balance that embracing of local ecology, you have to also acknowledge that the summer can be very unpleasant for people. So how do you provide human comfort in an otherwise uncomfortable environment? So the parts that we tried to embrace, you know, the open views, the beautiful vegetation, the view of the mountains in the distance, but also keeping in mind that it's a very hot place, and what can we do to mitigate that heat. And with the site design and location of human spaces, make those a little bit more comfortable. So there you can see a few credits that were earned through this design strategy. And as you can see, one strategy can address multiple credits. So by keeping air quality in mind, human comfort, opportunities for social connection in mind, we achieved multiple credits. Next slide, please. So this is an example of the employee patio that you saw on the last slide from a different angle. So really here you can see different size areas being provided for different size gatherings. The employee patio is to the east of the main building, so it's protected from the primary direction of the winds from the west and the intense western sun. We provided seating. There are views to the south and to the west, obviously recycling and trash receptacles, shade from both the structure and from desert trees, which you can see on the left starting to grow in, and there's also a grill for employees to use. And again, the high SRI materials to help reduce heat and improve human comfort. Next slide, please. So this shows the way going north from the port into the United States. So on the left, you see those desert willows that will shade the walkway once they reach maturity. Another part of providing human comfort is some enclosed spaces that provide more of a sense of passage and a little bit of protection from the wide open expanses of the Chihuahuan Desert. This project also included public restrooms, which you can see in the distance where that shade canopy is behind the student travelers. And then some public artwork also to improve the experience for pedestrian travelers. Next slide, please. I think one of the really cool things about doing the site documentation was that we went through the process of generating performance metrics for the site that we might not otherwise do for a project. So seeing these numbers was really interesting for us and very confirming of the effectiveness of these strategies that we've talked about. So Aaron talked about the stormwater management site design and strategies, and that results in about 2.5 million gallons of stormwater being directed to the landscape, and that's a direct offset of irrigation needs. And the irrigation for this site was designed so that most of the system can be turned off after an establishment period. So after that establishment period, our EPA WaterSense calculation showed that we were at 97% below the baseline and 76% below the baseline during that initial establishment period. So that was some pretty great confirmation to get. Aaron talked about the restoration, vegetation, and soil strategies that resulted in 12.5 acres of restored grassland. All of the paving and roofing materials were high SRI for heat reduction, heat island reduction. And at maturity, over 1 acre of the pavement will be shaded by trees and shade structures. So here on the right, you can see an example of the shade being provided by the shade structure. And it's estimated that about 6,000 tons of recycled concrete were used. Those were salvaged from the old port facility and reused in the gabion walls you can see along the right there. Next slide, please. So in this slide, you can see the recycled or salvaged concrete being used in the gabion mattresses in the desert wash stormwater management area, and then the water harvesting terraces behind that. And next slide, please. So we're going to go over a few of our tips and lessons learned. As Aaron said, the earlier you can start the site's process, the easier your documentation process will be. Another thing we found very helpful was to make coordination checklists to communicate with the different disciplines and also with the contractor, and it really helped to break down the documentation into bite-sized pieces for each team member to be able to more quickly and efficiently address their part of the documentation. We held regular team communications specific to the site's process So those were weekly calls as needed, and then they became monthly calls later in the project. And then another suggestion is to really over communicate and get everything in writing. There are a lot of details to the documentation, so to keep track of it, it's really necessary to over communicate and make sure you're meeting your project goals and certification goals. Next slide, please. So another suggestion that we would have, and this is kind of a basic one but very important, is to keep in mind the credits that are possible given your project constraints. So all projects have credits that are going to be easier to achieve or impossible to achieve. So keeping those in mind from the outset, what might be possible to change as you go along and which credits are really off the table. And it was helpful to read the credit requirements very carefully and then reread them another 2 or 3 times to really make sure that the detail and documentation requirements were understood before jumping into the actual documentation. And then, as Danielle said, there is lead overlap for sites that include buildings. So for those credits and prereqs for us, those lead overlaps went pretty quickly and the documentation was very straightforward. So I'm going to turn it back to Aaron to wrap up the presentation.
So we were asked to sort of give some commentary on what added value the site's certification brought to the project. So a big one for us is it provided a mandate that everybody had to stick to, and we really had to follow the landscape best practices, and not only through design but into construction and also into operations and maintenance. So you get to that period where as designers we sort of lose control, and so to be able to influence the operations and maintenance guidelines for the site so that it can live on successfully when we're no longer involved in the project. It was also a very educational process, not only for us, but for the owner. And that sort of leads to the next piece about education about landscape aesthetics and setting landscape expectations. So we had to help sort of steer and educate the client and the users away from an expectation for a ornamental landscape, more typical to other large federal facilities. And so by educating the team and having sites influence and provide leverage for really looking at this instead and saying, no, we're going to restore a native landscape that is very beautiful, and not only is beautiful, but will reduce initial costs because we're not overly amending the native soils, working extra hard to put stormwater in pipes and to send it off site, but also the reduced maintenance costs. So instead of needing to maintain an ornamental landscape and be pruning and trimming and mowing plants, instead selecting appropriate plants and allowing them to just be themselves and to be beautiful on their own with very little intervention from maintenance folks. And then also that the site's program really helped complement the LEED goal, and they were successful in achieving LEED Platinum, and part of that came from the extra emphasis on the site conservation efforts. And then it also achieved an AIA Coat Top 10 award this year, which we're very excited about, or actually 2019 we're very excited about. So that recognizes sustainability projects across the world. So that's it for Tess and I. We appreciate the opportunity to talk about our project, and we will take any questions that you have for us.
Great. We had a couple questions come in. This is Paul from USGBC. There were some general questions about the project, like people were surprised that you could have a land-based port, and were impressed by that. Wanted to know how the school bus pickup and drop-off worked. And tell us a little about, you mentioned the surrounding property owners. It was hard to tell who they were in that region. Can you give us a little bit more background on those things?
Yes, so let's see, the school buses, I'm not sure exactly what happens on the Paloma side. My understanding is for the most part, the students walk, but I believe there may be some busing that happens on the Mexico side to the port. And then those students walk across every single day. They have to pass through the port facility, go through the checkpoint, and then they go through the pedestrian zone, and then they get on a school bus and they ride the school bus just north of the port to either Columbus, which has public schools, and then to Deming, which is where the high school is. And Deming's about 30 minutes to the north. So that happens every day, and then the reverse of it in the afternoon, those school buses drop students off. They have to, again, pass through the port on foot and then meet their parents or guardians on the other side. So that's how this worked for school children. They're a primary pedestrian user of the port. Let's see, adjacent land owners. So they were private landowners actually to the east of the site. So those are ranch lands that are kind of minimally managed and I believe that's also the case to the north. And then to the west of the site is a series of either commercial owners, like there's a couple of retail stores, some transit or some travel kind of information centers for people who are coming to the United States. So kind of a collection of different private landowners and commercial users to the west of our site.
Great. We also had a couple questions about sort of the ongoing maintenance and operating. Is there any special training for who's doing that? And how is the GSA tracking it? And do you have any involvement in that? Or what's the future hold for maintaining all this?
Yeah, those are great questions. So we will have to follow up to ourselves to sort of track it. It's been passed off to a contract holder that manages the site that the GSA manages from their offices in El Paso. And that contractor was given a set of requirements and contract requirements, but also the operations and maintenance guidelines that we created through the sites program. And there absolutely was some education involved as far as follow-up. That hasn't happened yet, but that's something that we intend to do. I don't know that the GSA has a specific strategy for that or a plan in place, but we as the design team were very interested in tracking the performance to see whether those maintenance guidelines are being followed and whether there's issues that come up. But yes, a big part of this is leave the landscape alone. And that kind of comes in conflict oftentimes with either the practices that these companies are used to or an expectation to make it look like they're doing something. So a tendency to think they need to cut stuff to justify their existence out there. Yep. So that education piece for sure, but also, the security and safety is a paramount concern. And so plant selection was very deliberate and careful to maintain sight lines across the site. We had limitations on the height of some of the vegetation in certain areas where visibility was important. So we're hoping that plant selection was appropriate and successful, and that they aren't having to do additional maintenance to improve visibility, but that not only is the landscape maintenance company having to follow our guidelines, they're also having to take directions from the port director who may see issues or have concerns that come up on site that will require potential changes or maintenance that's outside of what's in our application. So we are not part of that process. We are going to interject ourselves in as best as we can and work with the GSA, who's very open to that, to try to track the site performance over time.
And I'll just add that our operations and maintenance manual for the Section 8 credits kind of dovetailed with the existing GSA contract for maintenance. And the GSA contract did in many ways make it easier to do the operations maintenance manual because it already included requirements for integrated pest management, on-site composting where possible, things like that really supported the operations and maintenance manual, so that our manual was really a supplement to that document And we did point out the differences between the GSA standard maintenance contract and the things in the operations and maintenance manual, and had some communications with the people in charge of those contracts about those differences and what the expectations were for site maintenance, and also why there were those expectations. And earlier, or maybe it was right after construction, the project manager did communicate with us about wanting to mow certain areas and whether that was acceptable and how that would affect the vegetation health. So, so hopefully that communication will continue.
That's great, and it'll be fascinating to see how that evolves, and we're happy to be helpful in any way that we can. The GSA has been incredibly supportive and excited about sites, has adopted it as a formal requirement for its projects moving forward across the country. There were a couple questions about whether there were any conflicts between sites requirements and GSA requirements. Do you have any particular advice for project teams working with federal agencies?
Let me just throw out one example of a conflict. So it's not specifically a GSA conflict with sites, but more a Customs and Border Protection conflict and just the nature of the site itself. So there are sites credits related to light output and night sky. And with this particular project and with the safety and security requirements, because it's a 24-hour facility, the whole thing has to be lit up like a Christmas tree is essentially how it was described to us. So going after any of those kind of light pollution, lighting level credits was completely off the table. It just certainly wasn't feasible with our project. So that's one example of a conflict. There were a couple others, many of which we were able to work around. There are some sites credits about, providing community spaces or community gardens or a walking track or things like that that just simply cannot be done at a port facility where you're essentially moving through as quickly as possible, right? And not lingering and gathering in groups because of security. And then tips for working with federal agencies. So one of the things we talked about was over communicating and getting things in writing. So the mandate was to achieve sites gold. We had a strategy for getting there, and with a little bit of cushion. And then as we got later in the process, documentation process, we kind of got to the point where the rubber meets the road in terms of getting signatures and sign off on documentations about, in particular, ongoing operations and maintenance and monitoring, commissioning and monitoring of the site. And what we ran up against was problem with government procurement, and that getting in the way of us, their process for procuring those kinds of services, and tying it to a project cost, which I won't elaborate too much on, but essentially achieving some of those ongoing monitoring credits that requires consultant fees and or testing fees became very difficult. So we had to go back and say, well, these were credits you wanted us to go after. They seemed feasible at the time. Well, we're now at the point where we need to document those credits, and we ran up against some issues with procurement. So we were one credit away from achieving the goal of Sites Gold, and we couldn't get there. So it's not that that's not a criticism of working for the federal government, but it was important for us to have been tracking all of that documentation so that we could come back to say, okay, well, these were the conversations we had. These were our goals and our targets as far as credits as we worked through the design phase. And, so it was important to be able to remember those conversations and have record of them.
Wow.
I don't know if you have anything to add about federal agency engagement interaction.
No, I think that covers it, and the GSA was communicative primarily with the operations and maintenance manual I'm thinking of in terms of what was feasible within their contract and what was a realistic expectation. So the communication there, I thought, went pretty smoothly. And as Aaron said, there were some credits that were just not possible given the site type.
So it was really interesting to hear that. And we'll circle back with you and the GSA folks about areas where credits might have been achievable that had we all connected better, they might be achievable for future projects. So that was really helpful. Again, great project. We have more questions, but we need to move on. But as I said in the chat box, we'll follow up with everybody afterwards and have Aaron and Tess go through all the questions. Thanks so much again. Danielle, back to you.
Thank you, Aaron and Tess. That's was really insightful and informative and very just beautiful and clearly a functional project. So thank you so much for sharing all that. So now I just want to move on to our next speakers, who are both from Epstein Group in Atlanta, Georgia. And they're going to be speaking about the Grant Park Gateway project in Atlanta. And so Amy Danner serves as a team leader and senior sustainability consultant reviewer at the Epstein Group Certification Department. She's got a background in architecture and city planning with specialized focused on health. She has over 10 years of sustainable design experience, as well as 4 years of experience in city and regional planning. Currently, Amy leads a team of sustainability consultants. Her areas of expertise span across several rating systems, including LEED, WELL, ParkSmart, True Sites, Living Building Challenge, and Fitwell. And Rudolf Redall is also a team leader and senior sustainability consultant and reviewer at Epstein. He has a background in environmental studies and has been working with the green building industry for over 6 years now. Currently, as a senior consultant, Rudy conducts performance testing as well as works with teams to better enable them to create more sustainably focused projects, which improve not only the environment, but people alike. He's knowledgeable in sites, True, LEED, WELL, and Reset. And with that, I'll pass that on to Amy and Rudolf.
Hi, yes, we are very excited to be here to talk about the Grant Park Gateway project. As Danielle said, both Rudy and I work at Epstein Group, and we're a multidisciplinary firm located in Atlanta, Georgia. We combine sustainable design, consulting, and commissioning services within our company. And we were hired by the Winter Johnson Group as the sustainability consultant for this project. So if you want to go to the next slide. So the project is located in the historic Grant Park neighborhood of Atlanta. It's a 12.25 acre green space. The Grant Park neighborhood itself is a historic, Atlanta's oldest historic area, and the park itself is the oldest park, established in 1883. As you can see around all the pictures, it's very heavily vegetated. It's a very historic area, and one of the reasons this project came about was the necessity to reduce the vehicle congestion on the residential roads around it, as well as from the nearby Atlanta Beltline, which Danielle mentioned earlier. And one of the ways to do this was to really look at this existing surface parking lot and improve that area. So like I said before, we were hired by the contractor Winter Johnson Group. The owner of the project is actually the city of Atlanta, and it's being managed by the Parks Division. The civil engineer was Breedlove Land Planning, and then the landscape architect was H. Gore. Next slide. So some of the constraints that the project faced were related to the existing conditions of the site. As you can see mostly in the bottom picture, there's a substantial sloping and grade change between the lot and the street level. And this was a previously surface parking lot with trees located in the medians. It was 8 acres of asphalt parking, and so now it is a semi-submerged parking garage. And we've preserved and added vegetation, which is now over 8.6 acres. Next slide. More of the constraints dealt with the historic district that in which the parking lot is located. So it is adjacent to the Zoo Atlanta. In the bottom picture, you can see two buildings to the left, one of which is the historic Cyclorama building and the new elephant barn of the zoo, as well as the skyline views of downtown Atlanta in the background. So being able to maximize those views was a unique opportunity. A constraint, as well as an opportunity, was the location in the surrounding neighborhood and Grant Park. There was both pushback and support from the community around it regarding different aspects of the development of the project, which we'll get into a little bit later. Next slide. So some of the reasons that the site certification was attempted was that Atlanta is known as the city in the forest. So there was initial pushback from the community who didn't want to see the project come to fruition. Some, because of the removal of existing trees down in the bottom right-hand side, you can see a picture of Save the Trees of Grant Park, which you could see not only in this area, but the surrounding communities and throughout the Atlanta region, actually, because users of this park come from a variety of areas. Others also thought that it would deviate from the nature and the atmosphere of the historic park. So they didn't want to add in a eyesore parking deck. But some of the constraints were overcome through the design of the site. The parking structure became semi-submerged and recessed into the slope, and pursuing the site certification helped to address the societal concerns by ensuring that the vegetation would be protected, restored, and improved upon in the ways that would benefit the community as a whole. Furthermore, pursuing sites has allowed the project to step back and reassess the design so that it's comprehensive and all-encompassing, focusing on the design of it more than just the parking structure itself. And finally, by pursuing sites, the city of Atlanta became one step closer to reaching its sustainable development goals. Next slide. Rudy will now dive in further to some of the goals and the design elements of the project.
Hey, so going off some of the sustainability goals, the City of Atlanta and the Department of Parks as clients, they in 2010 outlined sustainability goals for the city as a whole, and that included a minimum of 10 acres of green space per 1,000 residents in the city, as well as to protect and restore the city's tree canopies so that there's 40% coverage at a minimum. They wanted to create and maintain park space and park systems which helped promote and encourage sustainable development while implementing landscape and facility renovations that reduce the overall maintenance costs. So of course, sites kind of lines up perfectly with that. And then from a project goal standpoint, it was to really increase the overall native vegetation while simultaneously increasing the parking capacity and the congestion within the area. But given the overall rainfall within Atlanta, one of the major goals of the project was really to place an emphasis on reuse of stormwater through the use of cisterns and the revitalized on-site management pond, which conveniently enough was able to account for 100% of any irrigation demand for the project as well. And then because of some of the feedback from the city, one of the major goals was to protect and restore specimen trees, which we defined as old growth trees of at least 30 inches at diameter breast height. And we made sure that these were completely protected and preserved from any and all harm. And then lastly, just a community aspect, we wanted to ensure that there was the ability to serve the community through bandstands, shaded terrace plaza, water features, a pedestrian overpass, as well as just the views of the city. Next slide, please. So these were just some of the design examples for the project site, as well as some of the credits that each attribute achieved. They were the green roof, the comprehensive stormwater management, and then just an overall human experience for the site to ensure that the site is a destination rather than just a parking lot. So next slide, please. So the first strategy was excuse me, the green roof. And as this was initially an open parking lot, the redesign of the site into a parking lot with a green roof really allowed for a transformation towards the overall green space goals of the city. And it also allowed for just an increase in the quantity and the overall open space and the quantity of vegetation and biomass throughout the project. And then secondly, through the increased use of vegetation and high SRI pavement, it really allowed for a reduction in the overall heat island effect from the project, which coming from a black asphalt parking lot to a luscious green roof with vegetation really makes a huge difference in the overall microclimate of the area. And overall, this project, through the use of the green roof, has actually become one of the largest green roofs in the Southeast. Next slide, please. So the next strategy that was key to the overall design of this project was just a comprehensive stormwater management. And this consisted of an on-site cistern, an infiltration trench, and a year-round stormwater management pond. So the first attribute of this was the cistern, which is an 8,303 cubic foot capacity cistern, which far exceeds the overall irrigation demand of the project. And it's important to note that the only irrigation on the site was just that of the green roof. The rest of the site is not irrigated. Following the cistern, we have a set of infiltration trenches, which allowed for any overflow from the cistern to then be forced into the ground and to help the soil mimic the pre-development hydrology in the ground and help the groundwater recharge. And this was to a tune of just under 5,500 cubic feet of stormwater. And then the last attribute is just the permanent and year-round pond, which this stormwater pond receives water both from the site's project, from the upstream area, as well as the surrounding area as well. It actually also helped to contribute towards the LEED certifications of the zoo due to its overall stormwater management aspects. And through these three components, the project site as a whole actually is capable of accommodating a little over the 80th percentile storm event for the city of Atlanta. And then next slide, please. So one of the last design elements was really the human experience. Being situated within Atlanta's oldest park, right along pedestrian, vehicle, and bike routes, the Gateway was designed with the human experience in mind. One of the major goals was really to ensure that the project was a destination and not just a parking lot. And in order to do that, that really helps to restore the park and restore the site to its original purpose, which was a park. And one of the ways that we did that was really ensuring that all users of all types are able to come to the site and freely use it. So that was done through the integration of the pedestrian paths, which connect throughout not just the project, but all of the greater Grant Park area. There's bicycle racks on both the upper level as well as within the parking deck, and they connect to bicycle routes within the streets. There's public fountains provided throughout the site to help provide relief from just the heat of Georgia. And then lastly, there's some seating provided throughout the project, both shaded and unshaded, to allow people to rest and relax while not only having views of the animals at the zoo, but the views of downtown Atlanta as well. Next slide, please. So some of the lessons here, the first lesson really kind of ties back to Tess and Aaron with regards to getting the project set up early on, since they noted they had issues with that. We initially were not sites was not a consideration, but as we were doing Lead and Park Smart and through feedback of the community, we decided to seek sites as well. And so once we decided to seek site certification, we set up this design charrette and did a credit by credit walkthrough to determine the applicability towards the project. And once we did that, and following some of the overall site's prerequisites, P2.1 and P2.2, we set up the design team. We hosted a pre-design charrette, as well as a pre-submittal charrette in this case. And then, kind of discussed all the variables, and that really helped the project get set up as soon as possible, and really helped to ensure a smooth and consistent process throughout the review project. Then one key component of achieving gold for this project was really frequently comparing the credits that were pursued, that were not being pursued against the project. Initially we were aiming for a silver certification, but through frequently assessing the credits that we had marked as not attempted against the current status of the project, we were constantly able to discover and identify new opportunities and new credits that could be achieved. A great example of this was C7.6, in which it wasn't until we were about to submit for the final review that we did one last check of all of the documentation and all of the credits, and discovered that the materials were still being reused locally, and we were still eligible for that credit. And going off of that, also the constant checking of the synergies with LEAD and sites and ParkSmart, just to kind of see what other opportunities there were available to us as well. And then one of the last major lessons was really the importance of the community. Next slide, please. So because of the feedback from the community regarding the impact that the project would have on the tree canopy, it really was important to spend time assessing all of our options. This included a comprehensive survey, identifying all of the specimen trees, and preserving as much vegetation as possible to ensure that all of the community needs were met. Ultimately, this resulted in a little over 3.2 acres of the site being completely preserved from disturbance. Next slide, please. So the overall value that sites provided for us, from a educational standpoint, it really offered significant value for not just us learning the synergies and whatnot, but it really helped to teach the contractors and those who typically do not think about sustainability. It let them learn about certifications and a greener way to conduct business. And then, as mentioned, the site synergies really were a huge learning opportunity with regards to just the multi-rating system aspect. With this project, by doing these synergies, it let us find credits and opportunities that could be attempted once and documented across the board. And in doing that, it allowed us to achieve our LEED certification without getting the LEED site gold. That really would have been a significant challenge for us. But then one of the other benefits to this and values is just that sites has allowed the city of Atlanta as well as the architects and designers on this project to just reassess the way in which the civil projects are designed and managed throughout the city. A lot of new best management practices emerged, and some of these practices we think the city will take forward to not just their sites projects, but their non-sites projects alike. And then lastly, the major takeaway for this project is really it offered the city of Atlanta a true glimpse into what's to come. Because the city of Atlanta, through a tax allocation district, they've committed to achieve site certification actually for all of their new parks along the Beltline. And this is a 22-mile pedestrian loop throughout the city that's going to connect parks and neighborhoods alike. And through Grant Park, it really offered the city a glimpse as to what they're in store for, even though this project was not required to achieve sites under that requirement. It let the city know what they're in store for and really gave them a glimpse of what sites has to offer for the city as a whole. And then I think with that, you can go to the next slide and we can take some questions.
Again, another fascinating process. And one of the goals of sites has always been market transformation. And your discussion of both the impact of this project on contractors as well as on the city of Atlanta and its parks department, its future projects are very heartening because it feels like maybe we're actually starting to do it. One of the questions we had was about if you were not the architect and you were not the landscape architect, you were the certifying entity. Can you describe a little bit the relationship between how it worked out between you as the certifying entity and the architect and the landscape architect and the client, especially when things came up like, should we add sites into this certification?
Yes. So this, they were a little concerned on taking on this type of certification because they had heard of LEED. It was easy to convince them to do Park Smart certification, but with sites, they just had no idea what to expect. So what we had to do was really dive into the requirements and go to the meetings, the integrative meetings, and really say, no, we can do this. It isn't that much more effort than what we are already putting in, and it will benefit everybody as a whole. So from the beginning, we were really the advocates for completing the site certification.
Great. And we had the same question, and it may be too early, that we had for the earlier project, which is once you've turned this over to the client, how is maintenance occurring, and are you involved in that, and what's put in place to ensure that it happens in a way that supports the work that you've done?
Yeah, so we have actually been very integrated with the city of Atlanta. They are the owners, but the Parks Department is actually the department that's in charge of managing this. So we have communicated all of the requirements to them. It's actually going to be the department's maintenance crew that will take care of the site. We have also been in contact with the parking deck operator. So they will help out with the parking deck aspect of the project, as well as some of the maintenance on the deck. But it's mostly being operated by the City of Atlanta's Department of Parks.
And just to add to that a little bit, I mean, because the Department of Parks, they sort of have their own set maintenance schedule and maintenance routine. So there were certain credits that we were not able to achieve just because the city, they were a little stubborn on wanting to budge on certain maintenance aspects. However, by looking into their own policies, it also did unveil certain maintenance processes which did achieve certain credits and did let us get additional attributes as well within the project. So it was kind of a little, playing around and tug and pull to see what works and what doesn't with regards to overall maintenance of the project.
But as previously said, the City of Atlanta will require site certification along all projects of the Beltline. So this was really a way to help educate the city about what will be upcoming for them on the projects around this 2-mile loop.
Yeah, that's really wonderful. By the way, for people who don't know, Park Smart is a sister certification of GBCI solely addressing parking structures, and it was inspired by LEED. Great. We had a couple more questions, but we're running out of time, so we'll follow up with everybody on those. Danielle, why don't you take it back over?
Thank you, Amy and Rudy. That was really fascinating. It's definitely much more than a parking space, and it's very exciting to see the effects that sites can have in impacting the people as well as the project itself in terms of education and policy change. And so that's really wonderful to see, and look forward to kind of following up and learning more as it gets used. I think it's closed right now, so look forward to that. So just to wrap up the sites events that are coming up, Greenbuild is virtual, of course, if most people know that by now. Most conferences are. November 12th, we're going to have a Beyond the Building session. It's Sites V2, LEED V4, and Climate Positive Design. And this session will highlight the climate crisis and need to foster the development of a regenerative built environment. The session is focusing on how outdoor spaces can serve as a much needed carbon sink and further reduce emissions and the embodied carbon in materials and so on. So please stay tuned for that. November 18th is our next Sites community update, which we will have Gulf State Park Lodge. You'll see an image right here, and I'm going to Paul's going to bring Rebecca in to give us a little tidbit for that. Rebecca, you there?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Okay, I'll be brief. These are great presentations, and as you know, we originally planned to present this project today, but Mother Nature intervened. The Gulf State Park Lodge project replaces a previous structure and site that were destroyed by Hurricane Ivan 14 years ago last week. The project was made possible by funding that stemmed from the Deepwater Horizon oil spill disaster 10 years ago. So we've got this incredibly biodiverse site on the Gulf Coast of Alabama that's also incredibly vulnerable. And then, as some of you know, last week on the 14-year anniversary of Hurricane Ivan, this site's platinum certified project was hit by Hurricane Sally, and we got 12 hours of 100+ mile-per-hour winds, and we're really pummeled. So the focus of our presentation is going to be on resilience, and this project really was inspired by the stormwater as functional amenity credit, and really approached resilience as a functional amenity. So I think we have a lot of lessons learned. The project came through the hurricane with flying colors. We're really excited about it, and have a good story to tell, I think, about hedonistic resilience.
Thank you, Rebecca. I'm really excited to learn more about that. I'm glad you're safe and the project has had minimal damage. That's great to hear. Thank you for talking in November. So with that, I'll just wrap up. Thank you, everybody, for joining today, and please reach out if you have any questions. Thank you.